Hello AP World History students, Mr. Lassiter here, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at Key Concept 4.1, Roman numeral 4, that is the new global circulation of goods. We've talked a little bit about the age of exploration, and now we'll look and see exactly what was traded after those networks were well established with European involvement. Here is the key concept as it's written in our course guide, so feel free to take a look at that. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to start with thinking about the Indian Ocean. After all, when Europeans start exploring, the Indian Ocean is kind of what they have in mind. They want to reach Asia. And in the Indian Ocean, up until this new age, this early modern era, no one had really dominated this trade network. There were a lot of participants: South Asians, Southeast Asians, Arabs, Africans, the Chinese, but no one established any sort of trade monopoly. In fact, people just controlled their basic regions. You paid taxes or tariffs on what you were moving in and out of the region, and it was everyone participating, very cosmopolitan. That will change with the arrival of Europeans. And not just because the Europeans show up and demand that they take over, but keep in mind the Europeans have certain military advancements, especially with cannons and the like, that allow them to control trade at certain points within the Indian Ocean. There are no real European goods coming into this area, but Europeans are kind of moving African and Asian and Arabian goods from place to place in the Indian Ocean, in some cases taking them back to Europe, of course, for sale. But they are able to establish what are basically trading post-empires, and we talked about that with the Portuguese. The Dutch will also do a good job with this. With the tactics of moving these goods from place to place and charging duties to do this, and also with military advancements, Europeans are able to control quite a lot. A good example of this is with the Portuguese. In their trading post-empire, they conquered the city of Kilwa, they bombard it until they force the Muslim leaders to capitulate, and then they kick the Muslim leaders out of the city. Now that fits with what we know about the Portuguese and kind of their intolerance to Muslims as they sought a way around the Muslim curtain. In 1511, the Portuguese seized the city of Malacca, of course on the Straits of Malacca, a very important strategic location for trade in the Indian Ocean, good, important corridor. Later on, the Dutch would take it in 1641. But in taking very significant cities, they're allowing themselves to control a great deal of trade while not having to conquer the entirety of the Indian Ocean. Calicut is another example of this, but not necessarily as successful an example. The Portuguese wanted to trade in this region. They asked the leaders of Calicut in South Asia to expel all Muslims, but their demands simply just could not be enforced. Keep in mind, the Portuguese eventually overextend themselves. They just don't have the manpower, they don't have the large navy needed to control trade all around the Indian Ocean. And so this is why we consider it this trading post-empire. Eventually, the Portuguese and other Europeans must simply integrate in some areas to how trade takes place. They must play the game, so to speak. And they become more of these middlemen in trade, charging fees to move goods from one place to another. One group that did this quite successfully were the Dutch. They learned this system well, and they worked within the system, charging fees to transport goods between places. But again, neither of these established a true monopoly over trade in the Indian Ocean. That would be in contrast to what the Europeans are able to do in the New World. Now, when we think about the circulation of goods around the world, we think about the Americas as well, right? This is a global trade network that is established as Columbus arrives in the Americas and people follow him. And one of the most important things found in the Americas, or elements found in the America, is the discovery of massive amounts of silver. Now, this becomes extremely important because it is going to create a common currency. The silver will be minted by the Spanish into pieces of 8, or pesos de ocho, and a common currency, if you remember kind of why currency is important, is that it creates more efficiency in trade. Instead of trading a chicken for a goat, but one person maybe already has goats, and you have something that everybody wants. And so these silver coins become accepted really around the world. And the Spanish are quite successful simply because they have this constant influx of money. They mine silver at places like Potosi, and they also mine silver in Mesoamerica. Over 2 centuries, about 40,000 tons of silver are mined. They're minting 2.5 to 3 million coins per year, which are sent, of course, around the world. Although, as the Spanish do not really account for the fact that money is going out and not coming back in, it will lead to some economic hardships for them. If we think about this effect of a global currency on different regions of the world, we can see it very easily by looking at some buildings and some activities around the world. For example, in South Asia, in the Mughal Empire, Shah Jahan is becoming very rich, or becomes very rich from the sale of pepper in exchange for silver. This influx of silver into South Asia fuels an artistic golden age in the Mughal Empire. And this is seen perfectly with the Taj Mahal, which Shah Jahan builds as a mausoleum for his wife, and unfortunately becomes one for himself as well, but still considered one of the most beautiful buildings ever built. Again, built with the riches that come from this new currency in this new era of global trade. In China, silver is traded for silk, porcelain, it's traded for tea especially. But China is more so a black hole for silver, some might say. If you see this map, you can see the dominant flow of capital, or the flow of silver around the world. And all the arrows are going into China, none are coming out. And that's because they liked silver as their currency. But they had no real desire for outside goods. They were self-sufficient. They were producing goods everybody else wanted. So Europeans will, of course, later be quite upset by this imbalance in trade, and so they'll learn to sell drugs. The United States even is not immune from this. When the United States is formed as a country and fights the Revolutionary War, the peso de ocho, the Spanish piece of 8, is actually accepted as legal currency up until 1857. Now, we can think about connections with the dollar today. The United States dollar is currency that is actually accepted in more than just the United States. Of course, now with our global system of exchanges, it's not always accepted, but nevertheless, still a fairly common currency, especially in some Caribbean countries. Now, with this new global circulation of goods, there are new methods of competition that arise, and this will actually help spur on trade just as much as it is a consequence of trade. And the first thing I want to look at are something called joint stock companies. Now, keep in mind that exploration is very expensive. A ship in itself is expensive, and of course, if it's loaded with cargo, that would be quite a lot of capital invested, and one lost ship or one shipwreck could literally sink your fortune. So how do you limit the risk of something like this? Well, the idea is that you start to share it with others. Joint stock companies develop as a way for people to pool their resources together, and then also to limit risk in a company. Royal monopolies are even granted to these companies, and basically they're some of them, like the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, are given exclusive rights to trade in a region. For example, in the year 1600, the British East India Company is chartered and is allowed to control all trade for Britain in the Indian Ocean, so no competition with this group. The Dutch East India Company is formed shortly after. It's abbreviated VOC because, of course, Dutch. But this is a much larger and wealthier company. It's about 10 times the size of the British East India Company. And it is quite successful in controlling trade in the Indian Ocean. Of course, there are other examples of these companies that we'll come across. But in general, these companies are an improvement over the old way of investing. So you get thousands of people that can invest in this, which increases your capital and your potential for profit. And these companies become even more efficient than what had been around earlier. And you might be able to guess why, because they're only concerned with profits. Think about the Portuguese and the Spanish exploration initially. Not only were they trying to turn a profit with their exploration, but they were also had these other religious-based motivations, right? Where they're trying to convert people in certain regions, or the Portuguese fighting wars with these cities in order to expel Muslim rulers, whatever it might take. But that is, of course, that's very expensive and it's very time-consuming. These companies were all profit-oriented. So there was no concern with religion, or, well, in some cases, no concern with morals at all, and allowed these companies to turn massive profits, always looking for ways to be more efficient and trade more goods. Now, moving on from the Indian Ocean, we do have a new system which develops in this time period. In addition to the IOMS, this challenger we call the Atlantic system. And the Atlantic trade network that develops really makes the world truly global. Of course, this trade network will be dominated by Europeans, just a few major European states, which put it in contrast to the Indian Ocean, where there's, for thousands of years, had really been no single or few powers in charge. So the Atlantic system emerges, of course, with the discovery of the Americas, and then later with the establishment of colonies. So this system was designed to become the most efficient that it could be. And efficiency meant loading ships on each leg of the journey and never sailing a ship empty. So this was seen in what we considered, or what we call, the Triangle Trade Network. The Triangle Trade Network involved trading raw materials, manufactured goods, and then the labor force for all this, which involved slaves. So when Europeans would capture slaves or buy captured slaves in Africa, they would transport them to the Caribbean, where they would be sold into slavery to grow things like sugar and tobacco, cash crops. This sugar and tobacco would be used to make rum, and so these raw materials would be transported to Europe. They might be made into alcohol. Manufactured goods would be then taken from Europe to sell either in the Americas or in Africa. These might include guns or metal objects, or just it could have been alcohol of some type. And if they were sold in Africa, of course, then they could load the ship with slaves and move it onward. Some ships would have been documented as going through all three legs of these journeys. Usually they would go back and forth between two places or so. Of course, cash crops play a large role in this, and we can see that with sugarcane. The sugarcane is an intense crop to cultivate, and so large numbers of people were needed to cultivate this crop, and that came from the forced migration of people put into slavery. We will talk a lot in this class about the situation for slaves and the brutality of slavery in the Caribbean. But right now I just want to focus on the connection between the growth and sale of commodities produced by slavery and the continued growth of slavery. And you can see that in the chart we have here. You can see that in each of these colonies, as the sugar tonnage increases, so does the slave population. And this is driven by a worldwide demand for sugar and sugar-based products. This is a legacy of this trade. And of course, this is a legacy whose consequences we are still grappling with today. So kind of as we come here to the end of this, we're not going to go into the Columbian Exchange today. as we come to the end of this, I want you to just think about and consider the new era that this global exchange ushers in. Certainly, the changes it brings about, also the positive effects of a global system of trade, and then also, as we see here, some of the negative effects of this, although that might be an understatement. That's it for today. I will be back with you in another video soon. Adios.